Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Schneider, J Street's Vice President of Political Affairs and Chief of Staff, and I'm really thrilled to be on this J-Stream call this afternoon. Just as a reminder, J-Stream is J Street's online presence in these trying times, our effort to try to build community and bring together our supporters across the country around our shared values as we all sit isolated in our homes. We're trying to actually not be socially isolated. So thank you for being with us this afternoon. We've had a number of excellent opportunities to connect in the past few weeks, and I'm particularly excited about this one. This afternoon, we're joined by our friends from the ACLU, Sonia Gill and Bobby Hoffman. And we'll be talking about what we can do to protect the integrity of the November elections. Of course, these elections are front of mind for all of us. As many of you have probably seen, J Street endorsed Vice President Biden this morning, and that's our first ever endorsement of a presidential candidate. We're super excited about it. We're also super excited about doing everything in our power to make sure we re-elect our endorsees in the House and Senate and elect many of the new endorsees across the country who are taking on members of Congress with whom we disagree. So these are really important elections, not just for J Street though, really important elections for the country and really important elections for the world, with everything going on. So I know we're all very concerned about what we can do to make sure we safeguard these elections and make sure that everybody has the right to vote in November. And that's what this call is going to be about. So this afternoon, we're joined by Sonia Gill. She is the Senior Legislative Counsel in the ACLU Washington Legislative Office. She's had an illustrious career. Prior to joining the ACLU, she worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She also worked for Senator Chuck Schumer. And we're also joined by Bobby Hoffman. Bobby is the Deputy Director of the Democracy Divisions at ACLU. And he works with the state affiliates and partners at the ACLU to pass legislation and ballot initiatives to protect and expand Americans' freedom to vote. He's focused, if I'm right, Bobby, at the state level, while Sonia has her eye more on the federal level. So that'll provide a nice jumping off point for this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Sonia first and then Bobby just to give some opening thoughts on what we can all do to safeguard the elections looking ahead to November, their priorities and what you're both working on. And then from there, I'll ask a few opening questions and we'll open up the line to Q&A. If questions occur to you though, as you're hearing from Sonia and Bobby, then you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Again, the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you type a question in there, then it'll surface and we'll be able to ask it when we get to questions. So Sonia, over to you first.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be speaking with you and your members. So I think probably the most important point to know is that sort of out of the gate is like prior to the pandemic, we already had major problems with our elections processes in the United States. The history of this country is stacked with sort of the struggle to expand access to voting to all Americans. And that struggle has continued to this day. That goes from everything relating to measures that would intentionally discriminate against and disenfranchise certain communities, also to the nuts and bolts issues of running elections that whether intentional or not, end up disenfranchising eligible voters. And that process of election administration includes everything from obtaining information on where to vote and how to register, to registering to vote itself, to being able to cast a ballot, all the way through to having it count. So there is a long process that's involved in order to have your voice heard through your right to vote. So that said, this pandemic has really, and so Bobby and I, have been in this game for like at least 10 years, probably trying to expand access and deal with those like meat and potato issues. Where we find ourselves in this crisis is that all of those election administration issues and issues relating to discriminatory voting practices are infinitely enhanced during the pandemic environment. And I think what we're trying to do on the federal level is ensure that that there are basic processes in place. So sorry, that's my dog. So the election moment, please. I think that's the mail person. And we're good. Okay. So ensuring basic minimum processes are available for the election to actually run. And what that is going to require is an expansion of early in-person voting, as well as voting by mail. A lot of people are talking about voting by mail as the silver bullet to solve this situation that we're in for people to be able to vote. And while that is a centerpiece of any policy solution that's going to be necessary to extend to people nationwide, it is also crucially important to ensure that early in-person voting is expanded as well for a couple reasons. One is because for many people, that is the only way that they can vote. This would apply to many voters with disabilities who require ballot marking devices or other assistive technologies in order to cast a private or an independent ballot. It also extends to language minority voters who require assistance or interpretation services, which are available at in-person voting locations, particularly in jurisdictions that are covered by Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which requires this kind of assistance. And also for Native American voters who who reside in tribal communities where the postal service isn't even an option for them because it doesn't make it that far, or they have non-traditional addresses. And so while vote by mail is going to be crucially important, it is not the panacea that's going to solve this problem to ensure people can vote freely and fairly. So those are the minimum things we're asking from Congress. We are also asking from Congress for a substantial infusion of federal funding that would allow states to upgrade their existing voting infrastructure in a way that permits them the flexibility to meet the needs of their voters. So in a normal universe, while the ACLU strongly supports universal voter registration, online voter registration to be available, the fact of the matter right now is that states, because their processes and laws are varied, they have different technological capabilities. So they may not be able to upgrade to an online voter registration system that's capable of serving all their voters. So we want to provide states with the flexibility to be able to upgrade those systems while not creating problems that would ultimately disenfranchise people, because there's just not the capability to do that at this time. We're on a deadline. November is right around the corner. Primaries are already happening, being postponed, or as we saw in Wisconsin, are resulting in system-wide breakdowns of the election administration and voting process. So we are taking this issue obviously very seriously and want to see real solutions coming from the Hill to make sure those minimum processes are available to all voters where they don't currently exist, and also substantial support and resources in the way of federal funding.
Thanks so much, Sonia. We actually have our first question before we move on to Bobby for a few opening thoughts, which is, what's your dog's name?
Bellis. She's a 90-pound Cane Corso, and she's usually very polite, but she's kind of protective.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Bobby, maybe if you want to give some opening thoughts about what we're seeing at the state level.
Sure. So first, I just want to reiterate what Sonia had said about, access to the ballot has always been an issue and was going to be an issue in this upcoming election, regardless of COVID-19. But because of COVID-19, these issues that we are seeing are slightly different and amplified greatly. So I think, when we're looking at states and working at, thinking about the work that needs to be done with state legislatures, with governors, with secretaries of state and state board of elections. You know, I think first and foremost, because we're thinking about casting ballots in a slightly different way this cycle. In 2018, we saw roughly 26% of voters cast a ballot by mail, which is still a very substantial amount of voters. However, in the 2020 election, based on the advice that we're receiving from public health officials and governors and others, with taking social distancing advice, we're expecting that number to be much, much larger. How much larger, we still don't know, and we'll likely not know until much closer to the election. But with these changes in election administration, come a lot of responsibilities that fall upon the government. First and foremost is providing voter education to voters, letting them know that there are opportunities to cast a ballot by mail, which kind of falls into the second component of what we're asking is for these state legislatures and state election officials to make it easier to cast a ballot by mail. Still in 16 states are require an excuse in order to cast a ballot by mail. So we would like states to make changes in order to allow any individual to request and cast an absentee ballot, especially when considering COVID-19. So, state election officials have an opportunity to create no excuse absentee ballots in order to allow everyone to request a ballot, or to make COVID-19 a reason in which individuals can cast an absentee ballot, and clarifying that for all individuals, and then providing that education out. The third issue is ensuring that states are able to process and count these ballots, because in many places, vote by mail has not been part of the culture in casting ballots, especially in many northeastern states and states throughout the Midwest and South. You see a very low percentage of voters request and cast an absentee ballot. Those numbers are likely to grow exponentially this upcoming election. So we want to make sure that there's staffing availability, that there are machines available to count these ballots, and that there are poll workers available to help separate the envelopes from the ballots. And then lastly, we want to make sure that any problems that occur with absentee ballots for individuals as they are casting them, they're able to cure the issue that came up with their absentee ballots. So in many states, you have to have make sure that all of the fields are filled out properly on an absentee ballot envelope, and then ensure that your signature matches. So for many individuals, especially young voters, the signature that they had when they signed their license when they were 15, 16 may look a little bit different now that they're older, have it flagged as a mismatch. And then we want to ensure that state officials are reaching back out to individuals to ensure that they have an opportunity to cure that problem and make sure that their ballot is counted. So as we're working with states and looking at the potential issues that are raised by COVID-19, kind of back to what Sonia was saying, we want to ensure that everyone's able to register, cast a ballot, and have their ballot counted. It's just that these problems look a little bit different, and they're significantly amplified in the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Again, if you have any questions, you can put them into the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to kick things off with just a couple. I think, I don't know if Sonia or Bobby, which of you this would be best fielded by, but I'd like to have one of you talk a little bit about the Wisconsin primary and what transpired there. And I know some folks are commenting that the way in which that was handled by some opponents of voting rights was in some way a game plan that might be followed looking ahead to the national elections in November. So if one of you could comment on the extent to which that may or may not be the case, and what happened there and the implications for voter turnout and voter well-being.
I can kind of give a little brief synopsis there. So before the election, Governor Evers in Wisconsin had called for postponing the election, and he also called for mailing ballots to every registered voter. As part of that process, he had called for an emergency legislative session in which, unfortunately, the legislature took no action. Following that, the governor provided an emergency order to delay the election, and then also allow for individual ballots to be counted, even if they were sent, or received within a week after election day. Unfortunately, the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin sided with the legislature and did not allow for the election to be postponed. And additionally, the U.S. Supreme Court did not allow for the election changes in order for ballots to be counted that were postmarked within a week of the election day. So as a result of this in Wisconsin, we still saw 70% of the electorate cast a ballot by mail, but a huge chunk, 30%, had to show up and cast a ballot in the midst of a pandemic. And I think any time where if folks had to choose between their right to vote and their health, there's a huge problem that's being highlighted. Also, as part of this, many poll workers decided that they did not want to serve as poll workers on election day because the possible impact on their health. So we saw a city like Milwaukee, where there's generally around 180 polling locations on election day, shrink to only 5 polling locations. The direct result of this was individuals showing up and having to wait hours in order to cast a ballot. And I think a direct correlation to the inability to receive an absentee ballot that was sent to every voter, because there were such long lines on election day, because people could not go to the polling location that they had generally always gone to. We saw a very, very large drop in turnout in Milwaukee in comparison to turnouts in primary elections past. So, I think there was a clear impact here by, folks having to be put in the unfortunate situation of choosing whether or not to turn out and vote or risk their health. And I do think that this serves as a warning for November elections and future primary elections, that if we do not accommodate voters and their needs, we're putting them in a horrible position where they need to choose between the two, and that's something that certainly us as voting rights advocates don't want to put individuals in the position of having to choose between the two. And I think that it is a place where the government should also do everything they can in order to accommodate people that would like to cast a ballot by mail, or vote early before election day, or be able to cast a ballot through curbside voting in order to ensure that everyone is as safe as possible on election day.
And then, Sonia, a question for you first of all, if you have anything to add to that. And then second of all, when we were in the virtual green room, we were speaking a bit about a recent piece of legislation introduced by Senator Harris that incorporated some of the reforms. We've talked about some of the reforms that the ACLU has opined about. I was wondering if you could speak to that piece of legislation a little bit, what it would do, what it wouldn't do, in addition to any thoughts you have on what happened in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so the only thing I'll add to Bobby's really great summary of sort of what happened in Wisconsin, I think part of the question that was posed also is like, is this like being driven by partisan interests? And the answer is like, yes, right? I think that I was shocked, even having spent the last 10 years fighting bogus claims of voter fraud and arguing that voter fraud is a pretext for voter suppression. I was shocked that Wisconsin's legislators would use the pandemic, the public health crisis, to suppress voter turnout to gain a state Supreme Court seat. I mean, I don't think that is the secret of what was the motivating factor there. There's absolutely no reason why the legislature should have challenged Governor Evers' decision. to postpone the election until they could create safe conditions. And it was just a really sort of tragic reinforcement of what is driving this effort to make voting harder for people. It is a journey for power, and that is it. So that said, the ACLU worked closely with Senator Harris's office on creating a piece of legislation that we think is really important. It sort of incorporates all of our main asks while continuing to allow states the flexibility, like I said earlier, to upgrade their election administration systems and to best serve their voters. So it has two federal mandates, which are minimally necessary for the elections to function. And that is an expansion of no excuse absentee voting by mail and a 20-day early in-person voting period. And the vote by mail mandate also includes minimum due process protections that should be applicable to every state. Those include ensuring that ballots that are potentially flagged for being not counted due to technicalities unrelated to the voter's qualification, for example, missing a witness or notary requirement or a signature mismatch, those voters are offered a meaningful opportunity to cure that defect, and so that eligible voters are not wrongfully disenfranchised. It also would require states to provide self-sealing postage prepaid envelopes so this doesn't result in a massive poll tax on American voters. It would also, there's one other piece that I'm missing. But anyways, it has those minimum due process protections built into the absentee voting process. The early in-person piece, like I said, is very important to ensure that states are able to offer in-person voting in a way that minimizes person-to-person contact. And anyone who's watched sort of images from previous high turnout elections know that we have a problem in this country of not providing enough opportunities for voters to vote, which results in long lines, hours-long lines, and crowded polling locations. And we saw that in Wisconsin. So we need to make sure that that does not happen, because either voters cannot vote by mail or they have a strong preference to vote in person, rightfully, because absentee ballots are counted at lower rates than votes that are cast in person for a couple of reasons. So that's sort of the big sort of federal mandate. And then the Harris bill also sets up $2.5 billion for states to be able to execute that, which is hugely important because elections are run on shoestring budgets generally. And in this environment where we have states that are having revenue shortfalls, and obviously increased budget crises due to the pandemic, we need to make sure that Congress appropriates the federal funds necessary for states to be able to execute these changes. The second piece of the bill creates a discretionary grant funding program that states could access immediately to make further advances in their election administration processes. So those would includes money specific to improving polling place management and line management that would allow states to adopt curbside voting, specific protections for Native American voters, specific protections for language minority voters, for example, giving states the funds they need to comply with Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, jurisdictions that are required to provide ballots in the covered language have to provide all voting materials in the covered language. So that goes for everything from voter registration, voter education materials to the ballots themselves. And that is going to be a huge cost on those states. It also provides protections for voters with disabilities, which has always been a very underserved community in this country. I think there are 60 million voters in this country who have a disability, and we have failed as a country to live up to the standards under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which require full and equal access by voters with disabilities to the voting process. And so those provisions would not only ensure that polling places themselves are rendered permanently or temporarily accessible, it would also make assistive technologies that are required for some voters with disabilities to be available through ballot marking devices, headphones, things like that. So we think that this is a really good policy because it provides that minimum framework that's required to cut through any legislative or administrative red tape where those rules don't already exist, or unwillingness by states to adopt those reforms, while also providing states a huge infusion of federal funding to shore up their general infrastructure to serve voters.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks for that. I have two questions from Wisconsinites that I want to surface coming out of our conversation about what happened in the state. One is just simply whether there are any, to the point about whether this is motivated by politics or partisan in any way, whether there are any Republicans who are somewhat high profile on the state or federal level who are playing a constructive role in trying to promote some of these reforms. So that's question number one for one of you. And then question number two is a challenging one from another Wisconsinite, which is there a point at which when there's so many issues with an election, we should simply threaten to say that the election is a farce, as opposed to going back and forth on what reforms might improve it, and whether at some point it's worth just simply not participating. So that's one question, and another is about Republicans playing a constructive role.
I could talk to the piece about building out alliances. So historically, conservatives have not supported progressive voting reforms. I think what we're seeing in this, and some of the rhetoric coming from House and Senate leadership, isn't continuing to sort of toe that line. But what we are seeing is there are conservative voices that are making the case for increased access to voting, because I think that there is an acknowledgement that this pandemic poses an existential crisis to the election process itself. Number one. Number two, you have voters implicated in this that tend to lean conservative, right? Elderly voters, rural voters. That's a lot of Trump country, right? So I think that is overriding the traditional, in some circles, the traditional GOP ethos of not wanting to expand access and accommodations to allow people to vote in a full and free way. In terms of legislative allies on the Hill, I have hope that we are going to be able to pick off a few Republicans. This should appeal to, because of the provisions that serve Native American voters and voters with disabilities. This is going to provide a huge financial boon to a lot of states that are represented by Senate Republicans, Alaska, North Dakota, Ohio, Mississippi. These are states that need money to run their elections, to serve their voters. And even in states that already offer vote by mail, like Utah, Mike Lee and Mitt Romney represent Utah, they're still going to get money. So under this proposal, so they would save on a lot of those startup costs that are associated with ramping up a vote by mail system, and still have funding necessary, substantial funding, to be able to provide special accommodations to make sure that their voters can vote.
Bobby, anything to add on that, and any response to the question about whether at some point we're validating an invalid election if we participate in an election with so many flaws?
So I will say that no matter what, ensure that you are casting a ballot in November. The election system in the United States has always been terribly, terribly flawed. You can go back to the foundations of the country, where only white landowning males were able to cast a ballot, and over time and constitutional amendments, only then did we expand the franchise to many others. So I think, like, first of all, please vote in November. Please vote in your municipal elections and primaries in between. I think in terms of, you know, the worries about the system in general, looking forward to November, no matter what, we're still going to have an election in November, even with political forces, you know, possibly trying to make it more difficult for individuals to cast a ballot. The election date is set as, you know, the first Tuesday following Monday by federal law. The Constitution requires that the president be put in place on January 20th next year. So, you know, I think in terms of thinking about your own ballot, you know, please be certain to, you know, do whatever you can in order to ensure that you are either requesting an absentee ballot or taking advantage of early voting or showing up on election day and being able to cast your ballot. So that's like the starting point. In thinking about all of the challenges that have come up recently and have been part of elections in America for a very long time, I think the most important thing that we can do is continue advocating for specific things that we think will improve the elections and convincing others that they are not partisan ideas, that these are ideas that are good for democracy and therefore good for the country. So, you know, like the legislation that is being introduced by Senator Harris in Congress, there is, you know, in general, matching legislation in every single state of, you know, expanding access to vote by mail, expanding access to early voting, ensuring that your state has online voter registration, ensuring that individuals are being contacted if there are any, you know, problems with their provisional ballots or with their vote by mail ballots. So I think rather than giving up on the process entirely and stepping away and taking your own voice away, the best thing that we can do is engage on these ideas where, you know, we certainly think that the best way to improve democracy is by ensuring that more and more people have access to the ballot, and continuing to you know, advocate for that within your state and within Congress, because by not voting, you're simply silencing yourself and weakening these positions that we're trying to advocate for.
Excellent answer. Thanks, Bobby. Sonia, a question for you from one of our supporters is, do cyber threats suggest that online voting and digital solutions should be totally off the table? Should we only be for using paper ballots? I know there's been a push, a vote by home push on the part of some, and so what you think of that?
So in our view, according to our technologists, which are world-class, and many other, I think the consensus is that online voting is not a secure system. And so we don't support online voting. In terms of a paper-based system, because of sort of the cyber threats coming from foreign adversaries, there has been a big push to move to a paper-based system. And also included in this sort of policy proposal are what's called risk limiting audits, which would ensure, you know, by auditing a certain number of votes to ensure that they're properly cast for the right candidate, then you can verify like the integrity of the election outcome. So those are important pieces. But again, with everything, like the paper ballots solution is not the panacea. It is not accessible for people with disabilities. They require additional assistive technologies where, you know, to mark their ballots, for example, on a tablet or even a mobile phone, be able to print it out and send it in. You know, we don't advocate transmitting the ballot electronically, but we would not favor a totally paper-based system. But that's a really good question.
Excellent. And then a question, another coalition-based question from another supporter of ours is, you know, there's a number of groups out there, some older, some newer. There's the group that Attorney General Holder founded on redistricting. There's should have been Governor Abrams's Fair Fight. among others. Are you coordinating? Are you in coalition with some of these groups to promote these reforms? And which of those stand out as groups that our supporters should check out, and what coalitions might they consider being a part of, and J Street maybe even being a part of?
So we work in coalition, the ACLU, on our federal work, and I'm sure Bobby can speak to our coalition work in the states. This work only happens if you do it in partnership with other people who care about the same issues. I mean, ACLU has a brand, which makes us a little unique because we have the name recognition, which gives us, I think, a special platform. But we definitely work very closely with other experts in this field, not just in our federal advocacy, but in our litigation and our grassroots advocacy. On the national level, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights leads a large voting rights task force, of which ACLU is an active participant. There's another coalition called the Declaration for American Democracy. And that is sort of, that's a broader coalition, I would say, of groups that don't just focus on voting rights and civil rights issues, because there's obviously a lot of intersectionality with voting rights and environmental rights and economic justice issues. And so there is that other coalition that we also participate in that's available for folks to plug into this work. It's so important for people to do that in this moment.
Great. I have one other question for the two of you, and then just a reminder to folks joining us, if you're joining us a little late, that you can ask a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So question part one for you, Sonia, and then part two for Bobby. Part one is, what are the odds of something constructive passing at the federal level in the context of the COVID response? I know there's the Harris bill that was introduced. Is it realistic to expect that some component of that might actually pass? And then to Bobby, are there states that stand out that are doing an exemplary job in opening up the right to vote in response to the crisis that can be modeled by other states? So first to you, Sonia, on the federal, and then to Bobby on the states.
I do think that there is potential to get some of these reforms advanced. I think that we are in a different moment right now. I think there's a huge outcry coming from people across all political spectrums. Like I said, we have conservative allies that are concerned and are advocating for a federal mandate to allow everyone to vote no excuse absentee by mail. And so the potential is certainly there. I think the potential for getting federal funding is there, but it is an uphill battle. It's a fight. Republicans generally do not support any federal action related to elections. And that includes everything from like protective legislation to money that would help support the states. So it is going to be a fight, but the ACLU doesn't waste our time or resources on things that we don't think have a chance of passing.
And then to Bobby on model responses from states.
So, I think there's two different ways to think about this. I think the first is states that have already been a model in providing access to voters. So I think, a state like Colorado comes to mind, where they mail out absentee ballots to every single registered voter. Those registered voters then have an opportunity to fill out their ballot, send it in by mail. There are early voting locations where they can come in and return that ballot at early voting locations throughout their counties. And then on election day, they have polling locations available so that they can show up and return a ballot in person at their polling location on election day. So I think, in terms of states that are exemplary already for opportunities to cast a ballot, Colorado, Arizona, these are good places where they provide individuals an opportunity to cast a ballot in many different ways. And then thinking about it in terms of COVID response, there's been quite a few states that have been making responses for their upcoming primaries. Virginia comes to mind because they've made made a change in interpretation for their current law that because of COVID-19, every single individual for their upcoming primaries is eligible to request and cast an absentee ballot. The governor just signed last week, no excuse absentee legislation that will allow for any individual to cast an absentee ballot, request and cast an absentee ballot for the November election. We're also seeing a lot of traction in a state like Alabama, even where the Secretary of State is accepting any absentee ballot request form due to COVID. That is for their primary. We would love to see that state take that same action for the upcoming general election. But I think that's going to take a little bit of advocacy work and work within that state in order to ensure that kind of interpretation of the law continues in response to COVID. We've also seen New Hampshire take action there with their Secretary of State and Attorney General came to an agreement that due to COVID, any individual, both in upcoming, I believe, state primary plus the general election, are going to be able to request and cast an absentee ballot. So we have seen, many states come together and kind of view this through a prism of, responding to an emergency rather than thinking about this solely through a political lens, which has been good to see.
It's great to see some cause for hope in Alabama, that's for sure. I have one more question for the two of you, and then some closing thoughts from each of you would be great. One thing that we've seen in some places, I think Wisconsin was one of them, is kind of like a ninth inning effort to close down polling places and restrict voting in some ways. And this is something we see on the part of voter suppressing public officials generally anyways, but certainly more opportunity for those sorts of last second tactics in the current context. What are some examples of that have happened or that you might anticipate, and how can we proactively protect against them?
Bobby, I'll let you take that one.
Sure. So I think, once again, like a lot of times, I think these are problems that are oftentimes not dictated by necessarily malice. Most of the struggles I think most voters encounter, especially on election day, are due to, elections not being resourced properly or individuals not being trained properly. And I think that election administrators often have a really, really difficult task at hand, especially in the context of for Wisconsin, when they were thinking about shutting down election, polling locations. A lot of that has been in response to, not having adequately staffed polling locations and the problems that are being seen there. I think that has been a traditionally very difficult issue in many states. And our elections are generally run by a community of volunteers that are much older and oftentimes retired. But what we're seeing there is that there's an intersection with folks who are, most at risk to COVID-19, and the folks that are oftentimes our poll workers. So the average, I believe the average poll worker age is 61. So, the overlap there is, quite stark, and something that is likely to come up again in November. So we need to do whatever we can to encourage others to participate as poll workers, and for many people to, if they are able to cast their ballot early or cast their ballot by mail, in order to provide some relief for those polling locations, so that if they aren't adequately staffed, so there aren't, hundreds and hundreds of individuals showing up to cast a ballot at the same time at polling locations, putting undue strain on understaffed polling locations.
Excellent answer. Thanks, Bobby. So yeah, if we could just turn to you, Sonia, first, and then Bobby for some closing thoughts, and with a special eye towards how folks might get involved looking ahead toward November, since I know that this is an issue that's front of mind for a lot of J Street supporters.
Yeah, I mean, my initial thought is I'm so grateful. I'm so heartened that you all have organized this and have so many people participating and interested in this issue. We really need the voices to be broad and strong and invested in this fight because, you know, one of the questions about is this stuff feasible? That's a very legitimate question, and it's feasible if we fight for it. And I don't mean that, you know, in a sense cheesy, but it's true. And I would say it's important what's happening that your members of Congress hear from you, but there are also a series of reforms that Bobby is working on and that our litigators are working on that are being advanced within the state. So wherever the people who are tuned in here reside, I would encourage you to go to your Secretary of State's website or whoever your state election official is, your county elections or municipal election website, see what information there is up, and lobby your state and local decision makers who deal with these nuts and bolts issues on election administration. I mean, we saw this week also, you know, in Louisiana, that has a Republican Secretary of State try to propose advances that would make voting safer and more accessible for the people in the state. That was rejected by the state legislature. And so the fight is continuing, and the more outrage, quite frankly, that's out there about this, I think that stuff matters, as well as voices of support, like Bobby mentioned. You know, these people who run elections don't have ill will. They need support, and sort of support your local election administrators by, you know, if you feel comfortable signing up as a poll worker, can volunteer to help administer elections. I think that's a great way to get involved also.
Excellent. Thanks, Sonia. Bobby?
First, thank you for the invitation. It was great to be here today. I think just to circle back to the conversation we had about partners, in nearly every state that we work with a voting rights coalition. In nearly every state, there is a state level chapter or affiliate of the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, or Common Cause that we work very, very closely with on these issues. We've also been working closely with an organization called All Voting is Local, which really focuses on the nuts and bolts of local election administration. And they do a lot of great advocacy work on this at kind of the county and local level, making sure that elections are administered properly. For us, like the great amount of work that we're going to be doing is we have the federal legislation that Sonia mentioned that we're going to be advocating for and ensuring that there is adequate funding that hopefully then comes down to the states. That funding, what we would love to advocate for is for some of that funding to come in and then ensure that in every state, state election administrators are sending out ballots or absentee ballot request forms to every single registered voter, providing early voting opportunities, and then providing prepaid postage as part of the election administration process, because for many voters who don't want to leave the house, if you don't have a stamp at home, that shouldn't be, you shouldn't be put in a position where, casting a ballot is a choice between having to head out to the store and, hopefully, not put yourself at risk in order to cast a ballot. So prepaid postage, while seemingly as a small thing, will have a very big impact on elections. So we're going to have in many states a specific ask that we're making of governors, secretaries of state, state boards of elections, state legislatures. So if you get in contact with your local ACLU, the state affiliate, we can put you in the right direction to helping advocate to expand access to the ballot for November.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you again, both of you, Sonia and Bobby, for joining us this afternoon, spending so much time with J Street's leaders from across the country. Great participation in this call. I want to thank everybody across the country who joined us for this J Stream session on protecting November's elections this afternoon. I want to make a couple announcements in closing. Number one, go to jstreet.org/jstream to see our upcoming webinars and on-demand briefings. We have recordings of past sessions that you can watch after the fact if you weren't able to join us. Of course, follow us on social media at jstreet.org. And please have a good weekend. I know it feels like one long day these days, but I hope everybody manages to spend some time with their families this weekend and maybe even get out for a walk where it's safe. So thank you again to Sonia and Bobby. I hope you both have a great weekend. I hope your families are well too.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks, Ben.